My friends, we are gathered here today to mourn the passing of Battleborn. Unloved by most, a disappointment to many, a source of joy for a rare few. Its short life was marked by a brief period of tenuous good health, then a rapid decline into obscurity. And now, on January the 31st, 2021, Battleborn will be, or has been if it takes me too long to finish this video, which is certain, shut down for good. Battleborn was one of the very few games I've ever pre-ordered. I take some small, probably foolish pride in the fact that I've never regretted any of those pre-orders. I like to think, again foolishly, that I have an eye for games that will turn out to be games I like. And so it was with Battleborn. However, it turns out I don't have an eye for games other people like, because almost immediately it was clear that Battleborn was struggling to reach the player base required for any online-only game to be healthy. There are many reasons for that, but first let's take a look at what sort of game Battleborn actually is. Was. Sigh, now I'm depressed again. Well, to be honest, describing what sort of game Battleborn was is something of a challenge, and that's kind of a big reason as to why it failed. Was it a predominantly single-player game? It certainly had a campaign that you could play in single player, but you still had to be online, and if you weren't playing with a group of 4, you definitely weren't experiencing the single player aspect of the game at its best. Was it a predominantly multiplayer game? And if so, what sort of multiplayer game? Co-op? PvE? PvP? Hero shooter? Something more like Counter-Strike or Call of Duty? A MOBA? Potential players didn't know what to make of it, and it seemed that 2K Games' marketing department didn't know what to make of it either. People got the idea that Battleborn was positioning itself as a direct competitor to Overwatch, which ended up being released a few weeks after Battleborn. Whether this was a deliberate tactic on behalf of 2K Games, or something that consumers latched onto of their own volition, is debatable, but the upshot was simple. In the minds of the public, Overwatch and Battleborn were at war, and in popular opinion there could be only one winner. And it sure as hell wasn't going to be Battleborn. For me personally, my first experiences with Battleborn were undeniably confusing. I started off with the campaign mode, and it seemed like a moderately enjoyable but fairly insubstantial and somewhat half-assed experience. If this was the meat of the game, I thought, I was going to be disappointed. At that time in my illustrious gaming career, I was still rather wary of team-based competitive online games. I'd never really played a MOBA before, and every online shooter I'd played, even if they had team-based modes, you were pretty free to just rampage around the battlefield, lost in your own little world of mayhem. But when it came to the competitive multiplayer, Battleborn seemed to be asking you to choose a role and work as a team to achieve a specific objective. To me that seemed rather more sophisticated than other shooters I'd played, such as Call of Duty, so I defaulted back to the lens I continue to mostly view online games through, World of Warcraft. Of course, Battleborn was nothing like WoW, but hey, there was a healer character, and I'd done plenty of healing in WoW, so maybe that was a good place to start. So I picked Miko, the weird alien mushroom thing, and dived into an incursion match, which seemed to be the mode Battleborn was pushing as its premier mode. It took me a few matches to even begin to understand how it worked, but basically it's like this. You have 2 giant sentry robots, and your opponents have 2 as well. Periodically, waves of smaller robots will spawn at your base and march along a predetermined path towards your opponent's sentries. It's your job to shepherd these minions towards their goal, which will allow you to damage and eventually destroy the enemy sentries. Scattered amongst the battlefield are other objectives, such as neutral monsters you can defeat, giving you significant combat advantages. As many of you will no doubt be aware, what I'm describing here is basically the fundamental gameplay of a MOBA, and that's really what this is. In my video on League of Legends I talked briefly about how Battleborn was really the game that got me into MOBAs in the first place, but when I first played Battleborn I had no real idea what a MOBA was. All I knew was that I really loved this incursion game mode. Although I was still hesitant to truly embrace an online team-based game, I was having a lot of fun. And in truth Battleborn didn't really seem to require a whole heap of true teamwork. Eventually it might have, if people stuck with it and took it seriously enough, but in those early days there really were no established strategies. Sure, people tried to work together and to use their character skills in optimal ways, but for the most part strategies were no more sophisticated than kill the little robots, kill the neutral monsters if you can, build whatever structures you can, and of course kill enemy players at every opportunity. But even at that unsophisticated level, it was a hell of a lot of fun, and there was plenty of depth to the fundamental gameplay. For instance, the structures I just mentioned. This is something that most popular MOBAs don't have, but in Battleborn one of the chief uses of the currency you acquire is building and upgrading various structures in specific places on the battlefield. There are turrets that automatically attack enemies, towers that give a speed boost to allies and slow down foes, and healing stations that slowly restore the health of anyone standing nearby. There are also places where you can spend a large amount of cash to spawn a giant allied robot, which proceeds down the lane towards the enemy sentries, doing a significant amount of damage to anything in its path. So, although the strategies of the macro game were undeveloped, at the micro level there were quite a lot of tactics at your disposal. Of course, the most important decision you can make was which character you would play as. Like I said, I initially gravitated towards Miko, the most potent healer in the game. In a way, Miko being a fungus has no gender, played a lot like Mercy in Overwatch, or perhaps it would be more relevant to compare it to Team Fortress's Medic, which was really the precursor to this gameplay style. Basically, you follow a teammate around, firing a beam that heals them gradually over time. You have some offensive potential as well, but mostly Miko just chases after teammates, imploring them to stop for just a second so they don't die. It's not the most interesting or dynamic way to play the game, but it was a good starting point. Before long I was trying other characters like Benedict, the eagle-like creature with a rocket launcher and an accent from the southern United States, or Oscar Mike, the lovably enthusiastic soldier, or my personal favourite for obvious reasons, Cleese, who may be the finest example of a doddering old man ever to feature in a video game. Like Overwatch, there were three main character archetypes, namely tank, damage and support. Nobody seemed to take all that much notice of team balance though. Most people, myself included, just seemed to pick a character they liked and then head out to create some carnage. Maybe if I'd had the chance to play the game more thoroughly, I would have seen a genuine Battleborn meta form, and established tactics and team compositions would have come into place. And hell, maybe they did for some players who took the game super seriously. I wasn't aware of any though, and at the time that suited me fine. I just wanted to have some low-stress fun. And for the brief time that it was easy to find a match here in Australia, I really did have fun. There were other game modes, Meltdown, where you had to guide your minions into a furnace so they could be melted down for scrap, and which was essentially just a smaller, simplified, more intense version of Incursion. And then there was Capture, which was like any number of other online shooter game modes, where you have to fight for control over 3 specific points on the map. They were fine. Meltdown in particular was a good alternative to Incursion if you wanted something more fast-paced, but for me at least, Incursion was definitely the key to the whole Battleborn experience. And now I'm going to offer an opinion that, since I'll never be proved right or wrong, I can utter with impunity. I honestly believe that if the developers of Battleborn had focused solely on the MOBA-like elements of the game, if they'd made it free to play at launch and just worked at refining all the game systems so they worked around that core MOBA gameplay, it may very well have succeeded. It would certainly have been unique in the MOBA market, and I maintain that it could have found a wider audience if it had focused on just one thing. Incidentally, I think you could also make a strong case if you were to argue that Battleborn should have focused solely on the single-player and co-op elements of the game and completely eliminated the MOBA element. I can easily imagine the game might have been more successful that way, although I think it would have been way too similar to Borderlands, which of course was also made by Gearbox and had a pretty similar tone, and it wouldn't really have made sense for them to develop such a game. They might as well have just made Borderlands 3, which of course they later did, with a good degree of success. Anyway, happy as I am to praise Battleborn, it did have some pretty major flaws, other than its failure to disassociate itself from Overwatch in the public eye. For one thing, the character movement is slightly sluggish. It's not a huge deal in itself, but when compared to other online shooters, it does feel somewhat unwieldy. I have to acknowledge that Overwatch really mastered smooth, fluent movement in a way that Battleborn did not. And yes, I know I've said multiple times that Battleborn shouldn't be compared to Overwatch, but in some ways it's impossible not to. Also, lag seems to affect Battleborn more than many other similar games, as even a small amount of lag can exacerbate the slight sluggishness of the controls. I imagine this has something to do with network code or something I'm not particularly knowledgeable about in any case. All I know is that as your ping increases, your movement feels ever more stuttery and imprecise. Unfortunately, this was a significant problem in the bot games I played to get footage for this video, as my lag was high, presumably because they'd already shut down any servers they had in the proximity of Australia. And speaking of the AI-controlled bots, they're very much a mixed bag. Sometimes they seem to be working well, and they can actually be surprisingly lethal if you let your guard down. Other times though, they get caught on the level geometry or run around aimlessly, or have even more significant problems. Whenever the AI controls the character called Boulder, for instance, it seems to break entirely. In one match he just ran around collecting currency items, but not actually engaging enemies at all. In another match, when he was sadly on my team, he absconded from the battlefield altogether. It's one thing when human players rage quit, but when even the AI is doing it, you know you've got problems. This wouldn't be too much of a game breaker if the game had a healthy player base. Which of course it did not, for more than a small fraction of its limited lifespan anyway. Perhaps most damaging to the overall balance of the game was the itemization system. You could create loadouts of 3 separate items to take with you into battle, and then use currency acquired during the match to activate them. That in itself is okay. It's not exactly the most intuitive or enjoyable way to access items in a MOBA, but it basically worked. The problem though was that in order to acquire these items in the first place, you had to make your way through the campaign and kill bosses. Worse still, the items dropped by the bosses were randomized and had varying degrees of quality, so even if you didn't mind playing the rather lackluster campaign, even if you could find people to do it with so it went quicker and was more fun, you could still be totally screwed over by simple bad luck. Ultimately, your items didn't make too much difference to your overall effectiveness. The game was very different in that respect from something like League of Legends, but people who like to absolutely optimize their loadouts would have been frustrated as hell. It was just a clumsy, unnecessarily irritating system, and actually I think it's the best example of how Battleborn's lack of focus cost it dearly in the long run. It really added to the confusion people had over exactly what sort of game Battleborn was supposed to be. Going back to matters of personal opinion, there's one more big factor that made me love Battleborn, and I suspect made a lot of people choose to play Overwatch instead, and that's the characters. Or perhaps more accurately, the character or the personality of the game. And yes, I'm going to do some more comparisons with Overwatch, despite the fact I said it's futile to do so. In this context though, I think the comparisons are valid, as the personalities of the two games are similar in some ways and worlds apart in other, more important ways. A demonstration may be in order. Here are some snippets from Overwatch's intro.
In that one battle, they had Soundquake. Remember, he has like chest missiles. So which one's your favorite? Mine's Fusionator. No. Tracer. Yeah, Tracer. She's like, cheers, love. The cavalry's here. Pew, pew, pew.
Enjoying the exhibit? All right, playtime's over. Get to cover.
What are you looking at?
You know, the world could always use more heroes.
And here are some snippets from Battleborn's intro.
Invaders are descending. If it goes down, it's up to us to stop entry. This is the last chance to form an alignment and shorten the distance to the plan. Wish we had a fortune teller crystal ball in hand, cause can't see in the dark, not even retina scan. Deep in the future, we dig a hold of the prospect. Something toxic got in with foreign objects, war and problems we gotta get over. This affects the whole, we can't split soldiers. sight but still blind to hear though. Galaxies away, but our fate is real close. Puzzling arrangement, gotta put the pieces back. Double check everything, it could be a trap. The natural order preserved, so it lasts or dominate the resources. Feed off it, live 20,000 years.
The differences are stark. Overwatch's intro features highly polished CG animation. Battleborn's features hand-drawn artwork that could almost be described as crude and janky. Overwatch's intro features stirring orchestral music. Battleborn's features a chill hip-hop beat. Overwatch's intro contains dialogue. The characters in Battleborn's intro make no noise at all. And, in my opinion, Battleborn's intro is 1,000 times better and more interesting. Obviously this is just a matter of opinion, and I'm in the minority on this one. But for me, everything that Battleborn does with its characters, everything it does to create its own unique personality, is just far more appealing than Overwatch's cliché-ridden, bland, predictable presentation. Don't get me wrong, Blizzard's artists are world class. They produce some of the technically best CG ever made, but they go for mass appeal every time, which just gets boring, for me at least. But hey, it works. The masses certainly found Overwatch to be the more appealing game. And I'm not going to say that everything to do with Battleborn's characters is brilliant. There are plenty of cliches there too, and the humour misses about as often as it hits. But there's just this twist to it, an extra kick of sharpness and cynicism that really works for me. I love that Marquise is an aristocratic robot with a pathological hatred of poor people. I love that Benedict is a giant eagle/chicken with a Southern American accent and a profound love of military ordnance. I love that Isaac is an AI bent on the destruction of all living things, but with a voice that's permanently stuck on the most cheerful setting. I love that Cleese truly is a doddering old man, gliding around the battlefield on his big hovering chair and conversing with an imaginary kitty cat. And I love the smaller things too, the way your sentry bots commiserate with you after you die and respawn back at base. The way every character has a variety of taunts they can do after they kill you, when your camera is still locked on them, even if executing a taunt in the middle of a battlefield may get them killed. The way the announcer politely suggests you should kill the last enemy when you've nearly wiped out the opposing forces. And just the general chatter, the back and forth on the battlefield, the quips and one-liners. Normally I hate one-liners and wry quips, but in this game, I have to admit, I find them charming.
Brent tried my best on that guy's tombstone. Ain't crappy fun with glitter and
My three favorite numbers are 3, 2, 1, go.
If you've played Borderlands, the style of humour will be fairly familiar to you, although I'd say Battleborn leans even harder into the silliness. And of course that's going to be irritating to a lot of people. But if you're like me, you may just love it. Except no, you won't, because you can't play it anymore. And now I'm sad yet again. Battleborn was never going to be everyone's cup of tea, and even I'm not suggesting it deserved to be Game of the Decade or anything, but man, I had a lot of fun with it once upon a time. But never again. Well, thanks for watching. Before I finish this video though, there's one more thing I want to mention. A few people now have asked me if I have a Patreon or anything like that. I don't have a Patreon, maybe one day, but not for now. However, I have set up a page on Ko-fi.com where you can make a donation if you really feel like it, and if you really feel like I've earned it. One thing I want to stress though, please, please, please only make a donation if you can easily afford it, and I mean easily. And even if you can easily afford it, consider maybe donating to a worthier cause before me. Don't get me wrong, I'd be extremely grateful for anything you care to give, and I ain't exactly wealthy myself. And hey, if you are a billionaire, I'll take all the handouts you want to give. But I'm just some guy making fairly basic YouTube videos. So, you know, consider your priorities. Also, and I hate talking about my non-YouTube self, but I think it needs to be stated clearly in the interest of full disclosure. I'm unemployed, and I receive unemployment benefits, which are of course taxpayer funded, so in a very real sense I'm already receiving money from the general public. If that makes you think twice about sending a few bucks my way, I totally understand. In any case, I'll put the link in the description. Well, thanks again for watching, and if you've got this far, well, I applaud you. I still have to say it though, get off my lawn.